Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. We are in week 35, and I'm joined, as always, by Charlie Araujo. Hey, how are you, Charlie?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. The Mets, well, if we're not counting last night against the Dodgers, but otherwise they've been on a tear. It's been exciting. In fact, they're playing right now, so might be a short episode just so we can get to the game.
We'll try to keep it short and see if Pete Alonso and company can send you guys to the promised land.
There you go.
Yep. But on that note, a lot of happening is happening here in tech as well. We are actually seeing announcements both from big vendors as well as some of the new age AI players as well as always. But before we go into AI, let's take a step back and look at a couple of vendors that are probably part of your IT portfolio here in the CIO office, but not necessarily getting the same flash and dash and news coverage as everyone else. So the first story I wanted to look at today was this recent story that came out of CIO Dive covering mainframe usage of all things and pointing out that even as we are in the era of cloud, that it's we're still seeing a fair amount of mainframe usage and interest in expanding mainframe investment over time. So this study done by ISG Research looks like the spokesperson at ISG is Alex Baker, actually an analyst I know quite well and have known for past decade or so. He does very strong work. And it's very interesting to see how he's taking on mainframe compute and storage, a topic that many of us thought would have disappeared a decade ago.
It's funny. I think I gave up giving up on mainframes about a decade ago. I think that I was definitely in that camp for a very long time. And it falls to me in the category, and we're going to talk more about this in the context of AI in a little bit, but it falls very much in the category of it's all about value. It's all about how do you generate value as an organization, and then how do you align your tech stack to that value, right? And the thing about mainframes is mainframes are incredibly efficient at delivering specific types of workloads very, very well. And for most organizations that have mainframes, it's a sunk cost. They have it. It's sitting there. It's already in their budget. All of those things, a lot of the low-hanging fruit of workloads that were inefficient on mainframes have actually been moved off. And one of the things the article points out, and I know we have to get AI into every story, right? That AI and cloud, obviously both, to a certain extent, because they are pulling away resources on these growth-oriented activities, and because the relative pain of anything running on mainframe is relatively small comparatively based on this, that people aren't putting the energy into migrating workloads off of it. And if I was a CIO today, I think you'd have to really make the case of why I have to get off the mainframe. I think that when I look at the whole grand spectrum of everything, at least for these specific workloads, specifically for these apps that in many cases, I think you mentioned this last week, maybe have been running for literally decades, 20, 30 years they've been running, and it's because the core of the business hasn't changed. It's like, why am I going to go through the pain and suffering of modernizing something just because we feel we should? And to IBM's credit, they've done a really good job of, I think, revitalizing the mainframe collectively, the mainframe brand. They've continued to invest in it. And so, yeah, this article didn't surprise me in the least.
Yes, the only thing one of the ideas that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the idea that software can be finished. And a lot of the growth of cloud computing is based on the idea that software always has to be iterative and you're always making these updates and you're always patching it and you're always trying to keep up with the Joneses. But the reality is that there are applications and workloads that are basically mature and complete and finished and simply need to be adequately supported on an ongoing basis. And I think one of the challenging parts actually in IT right now is trying to figure out where those application categories lie because we are so ingrained into that thought process of always having to keep developing, keep updating, and keep being better when sometimes it's simply about being steady and consistent and making sure you can commoditize and reduce costs over time.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is the change that needs to happen is that we've historically looked at these very monolithically, right? We talked about the mainframe, or we talked about the systems that are running on it. And in fact, I wish I remember their name right now. There's a couple companies out there that I think are doing some really interesting work about what I'll call workload liberation, looking at a mainframe stack as an example and saying, okay, if I break this down as an end-to-end business process, what are the parts that I do need to innovate around, that I need to transform the customer or the employee or the partner experience at some edge, typically, of this business process that may be currently running on the mainframe? And how can I extract those pieces, innovate just that element, and connect it into the backend process that is running just fine on the mainframe and doesn't make any sense to change? And I think that's where we need to get to, is that we need to stop thinking in these sort of monolithic terms and be focusing on workload centricity and using that to guide those conversations. So it's not just that, I'm certainly not saying that just because you have something running on a mainframe, it should stay on a mainframe, right? There may very well be reason, to your point, that we need to move it off. And that goes across any of our legacy systems, any of these big giant behemoths, which leads us to another article about SAP having an announcement about their collaborative agent called, which I guess they call Joule, or their,
Joule.
I don't know if it's a copilot, but yeah, and having now support for open LLMs. And I think it's interesting, a couple salient points, and you can add some color to this, but the first thing is that their agent Joule only runs in the SAP ecosystem. Um, on the one hand, so that's just a closed sort of mindset, and on the other hand, they're embracing this idea of open LLMs, and I don't know, just because they don't want to pay potential competitors of OpenAI and Anthropic and others, or Microsoft. But I thought it was this really interesting juxtaposition of open source LLMs with a closed ecosystem sort of an approach. But I think part of it here is that if you're SAP, on the one hand, you want to provide air cover of saying, "Hey, we're doing things that are innovative, and we're staying with the times, and look, here's our AI agent and all of that." But by the other side of it, it's like they don't sort of they're sort of like the mainframe. It's like if you got SAP, what are you going to do? I mean, even if you wanted to change, you're just going to change to another legacy provider of
Right.
ERP. There's really no innovation or need for innovation for the most part in this space. It's happening around the edges. And so, I mean, if you're a company like SAP, we've talked about them over the last several months with lots of turnover and whatever. And I guess it makes great stuff to chat about. But the reality is they just keep chugging along like an Oracle, like an IBM, doing this bread and butter business. And I don't see that changing.
Yes, SAP and Oracle are the Coke and Pepsi of ERP, and much like this in the soda world, like you're not going to choose other than those two big options if you're looking for a default soda or ERP or whatever option, simply because you want a robust database and you want support across each department of your company. And frankly, there are only a few applications that are designed to do that out of the box at the scale and customization that a large enterprise supports. It's simply not worth getting in the game for almost anybody else. And then you have Infor, which is trying to be, I don't know, like Dr. Pepper or Mountain Dew or something, whatever the next tier is. But it does, I think that this raises kind of an interesting thought exercise of what that next generation ERP might look like. Because SAP is trying to say if you've got this generative AI co-pilot, which there's this Joule, that you're going to be able to do this. And they're not alone with that because Benioff has long said for Salesforce that Slack was going to be the next big OS or UX for Salesforce. People have been entranced with this idea of natural language based interactions to get to all of your data for a while. But the real question, I think, for me is whether that's going to end up being through a SAP or a Salesforce that is holding the majority of your enterprise data, or whether we are going to be sprawling this through, call it 20 core apps, and having some sort of brain in the middle to actually handle that ERP like work going forward. And I think SAP needs to, honestly, if they wanted to prepare for the future, they would start thinking about that expanded application model and supporting that a little bit more than only being wedded to the SAP data.
Well, what's interesting is I mean, they have. I mean, I was impressed. But this is back when Bill McDermott was still the CEO of SAP.
Mm-hmm.
But I was at at Sapphire. I don't know, this was 6, 7 years ago, and I was actually really impressed with. They had an entire section on design thinking. I mean, they've always tried to
Mhm,
sort of push the boundaries of like helping their customers look further abreast of things, right, or further afield. But that said, it's, and we've talked before about some of the challenges with moving to S/4HANA, and I mean, it's just really at the end of the day, this is blocking and tackling stuff. It is not for the most part a source of innovation or a source of differentiation for any customer. It's the
mhm.
blocking and tackling that has to get done, and how much energy. And anyone who's ever tried to transition off of SAP or Oracle, for that matter, and go vice versa, it's like you all this pain and suffering, a massive amount of money, and for what? So I think that's the real issue, and that's why they're so stuck. Now, I think there's some long-term risk here, right? If we play this out in long term, in the world of AI and high tech now, 5, 10 years from now, right now, the biggest reason for all of that is all the customization, all of the integration, the deep integration into supply chains and workflows and all of that. That right now, to your point, is the only way to replace it would be with this entire collection of applications. And the overhead and the integration nightmares are, you're guaranteed disaster. AI could change that, right? AI could provide an interface layer that has enough intelligence to stitch all of that together, where an end user maybe is able to avoid that, not see what's happening under the covers. And I could see where there's a threat to it. But again, I ask the question: if I'm a CIO today and I have a technology that can do that, is this where I'm going to apply it first?
Mhm.
It's going to have a massive cost savings to make that make sense, and that's where I think their protection layer is. The cost of change and the risk of change is so high that it's really hard to justify that until someone has a proven case study around it.
True. So I still think this is $1 billion idea, but it's probably also going to cost $1 billion to build. Let's be honest about it. Uh, so someday our children or our children's children will see the next generation of ERP. But I agree that it's probably not going to actually change anytime soon, given the
Well,
massive
if somebody
investments.
if somebody does that, I predict they'll get the Nobel Prize for doing it, right?
Yes, maybe the Nobel Prize in physics. So, as we saw over the past week, if you're a science nerd, AI was all over the Nobel Prizes, and it was wild to see. So, for the AI, for the Nobel Prize in chemistry, it actually made sense because they were using AI to do protein design and protein folding. So, it's a very standard biochemical challenge. It's actually one I dealt with back in college. And AI is fantastic for figuring out these new and novel proteins and drugs and all that kind of stuff. Like, fantastic. That's totally chemistry. But the Nobel Prize for physics ended up going to one of the fathers of a couple of the fathers of neural nets, Jeffrey Hinton and John Hopfield. And I find that fascinating that basically a computer science project won the physics award. Every single world class physics in the physicist in the world must be looking at this and thinking, just
Yeah.
WTF.
I read an interesting analysis about, to your point, the chemistry, and I think there was another one or I don't know if it won a prize, but they're talking about astronomy. And the reality is, science has always been about, he or she who can best leverage the tool to create an advancement wins. The tool isn't the problem. To your point here, these were advancements. It's a stretch at. I honestly, I don't even know under what basis they make this neural net tied to physics, other than I guess there's atoms flowing through the electricity or whatever. But it's a tough sell. But part of it is, right. The Nobel Prizes collectively all predate any computer science anything, and so it's, on the one hand, it's hard to deny the impact of these developments, and I would say they're scientific developments, but it's like, what category do you put them in? So for whatever reason, the poor physicists of the world lost out, but it certainly speaks to the importance of AI and everything that's
Yes,
happening.
neural nets are definitely important, but to me, this also says AI is definitely at the top of the hype cycle because if AI can shortcut everything else and literally win the Nobel Prize in physics, like it is hyped at the highest levels by the biggest brainiacs on the planet. So
And yet we're at such this interesting inflection point because we're going to talk a little bit later about another new announcement of another big model and some of what it's doing, and we talk incessantly here about OpenAI and Microsoft and Anthropic and Google and Amazon and all these big efforts they're doing, and now the Nobel Prize, and it's like all this, and then there's three articles here, four, sort of three and a half, that we're going to talk about. They're like the other end of the spectrum. So there's a CIO article titled "When is the right time to dump an AI project?" There's a Wall Street Journal article saying that executives are now they're being pressured by their boards to show returns for all these AI investments. There's a Fast Company article talking about, this is sort of an editorial, saying it's like, I'm all excited about AI, and yet it can't solve for some of these simple things that old school productivity tools are much better at. And
Mhm.
I think we're seeing this sort of weird state where it's like, on the one hand, there's all this hype and people getting all excited, remaining very excited about it. And yet there's this reality that we're having to address of, is it actually providing value? And if so, where and how? And are we being held accountable to it? So, I mean, what was your take on that sort of juxtaposition?
So I thought the CIO .com article by Grant Gross was actually a pretty good one in that it tackled the idea of when to dump an AI project. The reality is that half of these projects are probably going to fail. This point is also brought up in the Wall Street Journal article, where it says in various points that 70 to 90% of AI projects don't make it all the way through for various reasons. And so it's really important to figure out when to dump that project and when to admit failure and move on and fail fast. It's easy to talk about failing fast, but when you've started putting in the money and the time and the resources, you're $100,000 in, people have spent 8 weeks of their time. It's hard to say that that is a sunk cost and move on, but you've got to be able to figure out how to do that if you're actually going to keep up with the Joneses from an AI perspective. So I think that idea of simply defining failure and being able to actually act on it is an important piece of this puzzle that is understated right now in the AI world. Everybody wants to talk about how their latest bot or copilot is fantastic, but not everybody wants to say, hey, there's a 50% a coin flip, basically, that this is not going to work for you the first time that you try it, and you got to move on quickly.
Well, and we've talked about this a lot, that no slam on the article. To me, the sad part is that this article has to be written because these are the same things you should do with any project, any technology
Mm-hmm.
project. Well, probably any project. Period. Right? It's like, understand. I mean, if I walk through how does it define it? Define success. What are you trying to accomplish? Right? We've talked about in the past linking this to the outcomes you're trying to achieve and being able to measure those outcomes, connecting it to business needs. Make sure you're doing something that actually provides value to the business and that you can quantify that value. And then last is, fail fast, limit the damage, move in a way that you are controlling so you don't have this thing run away. And the fact that this article exists, and honestly, the Wall Street Journal article more or less says the same sort of, it's the same basic message. It's like, again, in what other realm do I go and engage in a project without having a clear understanding of the return that I'm going to get from that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just speaks to the fact that when AI burst on the scene 2 years ago, it was so novel, so misunderstood, or so just not even misunderstood, just there was no understanding that corporate execs were willing to open their wallets for experimentation to just sort of like test things out. And really the big message across all of this is that's coming to an end. That we need to start treating these AI efforts like anything else and be focused on, what are we trying to actually achieve? Can we achieve it with it? And how are we going to measure that and how we're going to deliver on that? And to a certain extent, this is just basic business of running an IT organization. And it just speaks to how poorly we've done to a certain extent
Yeah.
with that in for some realms.
So back when I worked in project management, the Project Management Institute estimated that 30 to 40% of projects, period, are challenged before they get to the end. And that is just normal. And one of the biggest reasons is what I've heard of in multiple of my past workplaces as the good idea fairy. So some executive, the good idea fairy, comes down and decides on high that something is a good idea and forces time, money, resources, and pushing out other good ideas to the side to get this done. And those often are 30% of projects that end up failing because there isn't enough due diligence done on the front end, or there isn't a strong enough pushback from the voices of sanity that exist in a company. And let's be honest, that is politics that happen in large companies. But at the same time, if you want to ultimately be part of a successful department, you have to have some sort of strategy for pushing back against the good idea fairy as well.
Yeah, well, and I think that comes in a couple of forms, right? It comes in, hey, do we, what this article talked about, right? Are we rooted in the business value? Can we quantify it? But it's also asking yourself, is this in fact the best way of solving for this? Because that's
Right.
the other thing I'm concerned about, right? Is that, it can still check the boxes, it can still be aligned to business value, it can be generating value, but it still may not be the best way of doing things. And the hard part is, it's sort of when digital transformation was in its big upswing at the beginning of the hype cycle. Everything magically became a digital transformation program because you could get funding for it because it was exciting and new and it sounded like you were doing something. And I fear that we're seeing some of the same things happen with AI initiatives right now. It's like everything is an AI initiative because you can move it forward and it makes you feel like you're doing something. The Fast Company article I thought was really interesting because and if you don't follow this gentleman, his name is Harry McCracken, and I love his work, and it's a sort of really grounded view of the world. And Fast Company, of course, mostly focuses on design, so not really a core tech publication. But basically, he's going on about the Nobel LM, which, by the way, if you haven't followed that, that is we probably should have had that on the show today because it has the ability to actually it's gone viral for doing these automatic podcasts. I guess
Podcasts.
it's
Yeah.
a threat to us. We don't have to do it anymore, and we just upload our articles and say go talk about it. And so it's gone viral for all that. And so he was talking about all the things that the Google Notebook LM is doing, but it landed him back on saying that he's relying on these two applications, Bear and Scrivener, both of which I still use Scrivener and I've used Bear in the past,
Mhm.
that just execute well. They have a specific purpose and that's what they're focused on, and it's not also all this other stuff. And I think there's going to be a lot of things that we find that we're going to come out of this a year or two from now and go, yeah, we thought AI was going to be the answer for this, but in fact, there are better, easier ways of doing this that we don't need to spend all this money and resources on AI to accomplish that same outcome. So I think it's just a good reminder of maintaining that focus.
Yes. So before with SAP, we talked about how its Joule is supposed to help with the automation of 80% of everyday tasks. But honestly, the next generation of what we're looking for isn't just automation, but inputs and interfaces that match what we're trying to do. So giving us information in the form of a conversational podcast with, again, the Notebook LM product is pretty cool. It has these, it goes back and forth with these voices that are very reasonable, very articulate, very well,
Impressive stuff.
very impressive ways of being able to describe different question and answer modes of whatever topic that you're looking at. It does that. That's the right way to be thinking about AI, not just automating a task, but doing it better and in a way that is more human and more interesting for the people who are trying to do this task.
Which leads to another article by someone we reference a lot on this show, Rex Woodbury, who writes for Digital Native. It's his publication, Digital Native. And he has another one out called The Design of Everyday Things. And I'm a huge fan and believer in design thinking, and this idea of using a design-centric approach to creating anything. And basically what he talks about in here is the fact that AI tools have gotten a little bit too in love with their own technology and are failing this test of how are we solving the problem with it. And that one of the key functions of that, of how do you know you're doing it, is that it should be intuitive, that it should, he uses an example of doors, that if you need to put a sign on your door, push or pull, it's designed poorly. It
Mm-hmm.
should become instinctive to understand how to use it. And the same thing with these AI tools is that they should, and I talk a lot about ambient technology, this idea that we should have AI, we should have technology just be infused into our workflows, and it just happens at the right moment, at the right time, and it's intuitive to us. And I think that goes hand in hand So even if you've solved for the article, the CIO article we talked about, or the Wall Street Journal article, you've solved for the value problem. You still need to solve for the design problem that it actually gets used by applying these design thinking attributes and approaching it properly. And in fact, interestingly enough, I think that's where Notebook LM has actually had some success because it is so stinking easy, right? You get this thing, you just click and drag your stuff into it and click a button and it's like bam, right? And you just instinctively understand how to apply it and how to get value out of it. And if you haven't looked at it, it's designed for like research, so it's great if you're a student. That's the use case, and it's brilliant. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And I think I'm actually very hopeful that we're at the cusp of this sort of shift where we start looking at all of this in a different light.
And I think Rex brings up a point again that we talked about earlier in the show about how more is not necessarily better. More text does not mean you have provided better direction. Just because you provide a 1900 word terms and conditions document does not mean you have done a better job of describing whether to push or pull a door open.
He also talks about it. He uses the term discoverability, which is users figuring out what they can do with the tool. And obviously, this doesn't really apply to the door example, but I think it's very contextual in the case of AI because the thing that I talk about a lot is the imagination gap. The fact that we as an industry have programmed users to interact with their systems in a very dumb manner, frankly, right? And now with AI, we have the opportunity to truly open up that window and create much more immersive, much more conversational, and much more contextual ways of interacting. Where it's like it's not just show me, and the example he has, not just show me white pants, but it's like I'm going on vacation. This is where I'm going. This is what I'm doing. What do you suggest? Right? Well, that's a different way of interacting that a lot of people aren't used to. And what I also love about it is that it connects the dots to the next story, and that is this how do you actually apply this technology in a way that makes sense? And so there's another announcement from a company that I had not heard of until a week ago called Writer. They apparently have a foundational or frontier um, LLM, a foundational model, and the news is that they have a new model that is excellent at workflow execution. And I'm really curious your take from it because you're more technical with this than I am on that piece of it. But what I find really interesting about their entire go-to-market, the company, is that they're extremely focused on this idea of how do you actually take action? How do you connect this to workflow automation in a meaningful way? And that goes to, I think, what Rex was talking about, right? How do you apply this? How do you actually make this stuff actually do something that's meaningful?
Yes, and I would say that Writer has an interesting angle in that they are very focused on aligning generative AI to processes. So basically doing everything that the robotic process automation companies are also trying to do, but based on their legacy capabilities. Writer basically said, we're going to skip all of that and go straight to the language. So what they've done technically is I would say a straightforward approach to what they should be doing. They are increasing the window size so you can do better instructions, and they are making sure that the instructions that you provide are aligned to the types of processes uh, and document calls that you would typically do in a business. All of that is pretty straightforward. They have a model that they've created, which is interestingly smaller than many of the other general models that you'd see. I think that's good because they've actually provided more focus. We're going to start seeing that simply adding more and more uh, variables and data to a model doesn't necessarily help. Like I think, not to just pick on Elon Musk for no reason, but he has his own model right now, which puts in every tweet ever created as part of the model process. And frankly, having spent a fair amount of time on Twitter, I know a lot of that is not useful data. So I am very curious as to how that ends up working out. But in contrast to that, Writer has taken a very focused perspective on both the data that they use and the model that they've created. And I think that's increasingly going to be important for these various aspects of what we want to do, whether we want an LLM that is more created to be opinionated or to be good at processes or to be more creative, which I do think is a thing that LLMs can be programmed to do to some extent. But you're going to want to have these specialized models because it's not going to be one size fits all, and it's not just going to be Anthropic Claude or OpenAI ChatGPT at the end of the day. We're going to see a variety of models to do the right thing for the right at the right time for the right purpose.
Yeah, so I look at this and I have sort of two schools of thought on it. The first is I love the action orientation. We've been talking about agentic AI a lot. Salesforce came out with Agentforce, and we clearly are in another hype cycle this time all around agents. But it's one that I happen to believe in. I think that we are rapidly approaching the point at which simply having someone to brainstorm with, an agent or a copilot, is very useful in certain contexts. But we absolutely hit a wall there. We hit a limit, and so being able to take it to the next step and actually take action in a reliable mechanism is critical, and that's what this model's about. Where I hesitate, and it's sort of like the conversation we had last week about augmented intelligence, the company that has, they're trying
Mhm.
to integrate symbolic AI and generative AI to solve some of these problems. I'm not sure. I still don't know if I'm entirely convinced that LLMs or generative AI is really going to be the mechanism for achieving that, right? So even if I have this focus on agentic, is that really going to be enough? I'm becoming a believer that you need to have other elements. You need to have the ability to have stuff that's a little bit more trustworthy than generative AI to balance the two out. Um, and to prove that point, Apple researchers published a new piece of research that basically proved what we all already know, and that is that LLMs kind of suck at doing reasoning. And
Right.
there's definitely a bunch of folks out there that are trying to make the case that it does reasoning, but it really doesn't. And this research proved it pretty blatantly and glaringly. And so we'll see. So I'm not slamming what Ryder is doing. I think I love the direction, but I think ultimately it's going to have to get melded together for this to really take it to the next level.
Yes, when you look at these AI models and look at their chain of thought and their consistency of uh, thought or reasoning, their form of reasoning, logic, which is really trying to figure out how to find the most common answer autocomplete for any sort of question. You find that the actual response it is hard to keep that response to be consistent over time without doing a lot of prompting and a lot of construction of that thought and continuing to augment that thought over time with additional context. You can't just ask the model to do all the work because we actually make all these little assumptions as we go through each step of a complex process, whether it be something legal or a complex manufacturing process or what have you. We make all these little assumptions that models don't necessarily understand or keep going from task to task to task. So we've got to figure that out for ourselves. And the Apple researchers basically understood that what we're looking at the end of the day is we take all these words and pictures, we transform them into specific numbered tokens, and then we look at all the relationships within those tokens, and then we try to translate back into human language. And it's amazing that we have the computational capability that actually turns into something that makes sense. But it does not necessarily mean that those numbers in the middle represent human thought and reasoning.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it is just about aligning. And this, I think that part of the issue is, right, this hype cycle was so explosive that we just had sort of a runaway train. And, going all the way back to the articles we talked about earlier about showing value, is that
Mhm.
it's really hard to show value when you have something that you can't trust to deliver the the solution or whatever you're trying to solve for, which that's why I think we're going to end up with these hybrid solutions to create the balance, because generative AI is amazing. Like I said, I never want to be seen as a bear on generative AI. I use it every single day. Right, it is incredibly powerful for brainstorming. For me, I often have a white page problem. It's like I don't know where to start with something. It is amazing for that. It has has great insights that give me a starting point. But I also never trust it to just, I'm always clicking on the links to go and check it out and to contextualize for myself. And that's great. That there's nothing wrong with that. But then, to try to make a leap to say that I can therefore have it and do some completely automated action on my behalf and me not be in the loop, that sorry. I mean, maybe I know too much to trust it to do any of that today.
Yeah, that's
And
probably a great lead in to our last story, right? So
exactly.
in the past week, we saw that LinkedIn, subsidiary of Microsoft, of course, they have taken an extra step in their terms and conditions to state that, of course, they're using generative AI, as we all know, in a variety of ways. But they're saying not only are they not responsible for any misleading or bad generative AI content that they create, but it is actually your fault if you then use that content for any reason and broadcast it, and it is seen as bad or inaccurate or illegal or anything else. So now the onus is definitely on you to figure out whether your generative AI outputs are good or not. And frankly, I'm expecting this to become a more common trait that goes across other terms and conditions.
Oh, well, I mean, we've seen the spate recently of I think what Disney had their clause. I forgot what there was. It was, had nothing to do with AI, but this lawsuit that they try to say, well, the terms and conditions. I mean, there's clearly that side, but I completely agree with you. We're gonna see massive disclaimers everywhere for this very reason. It is not trustworthy. I mean, it is not to the point that you should certainly not just rely on it to say whatever it spits out is correct. And so in many contexts, that's perfectly fine, but it is a definitive issue. Nothing I've seen is really it's gotten better, but nothing's fixed it. And I don't think anything ever will, frankly, short of combining with other forms of AI that are more controlled. So I think it is interesting. What I found most comical though was just the blatant tone of it. It was just like there was no latitude. It was like, hey, this is, we wash our hands of it. And if you had any question of how to separate the hype from reality, this should do it for you. That this is when attorneys get involved and this is what they say, that's your reality.
Yes. I, so I'll just read this language really quickly because I found it. I agree with you that the language is so straightforward. Like that, by using the services, you may interact with features that we offer that automate content generation for you. The content that is generated might be inaccurate, incomplete, delayed, misleading, or not suitable for your purposes. Please review and edit such content before sharing with others. Onus on you on editing that before you go to others. Like all content you share on our services, you are responsible for ensuring it complies with our professional community policies, including not sharing misleading information. Even if we give you the misleading information, you then have to do the homework to make sure that before you send it back to us, even though we gave it to you, it's like,
Exactly, exactly.
it's like
And
you
and
have
the
been
reality is
warned.
you've been warned. And look at here's the big takeaway. If you're a CIO, you look at this, and if you have any doubts, and I hope you don't by now, but if you have, especially if you're listening and watching our show every week, if you have any doubts about whether or not you can take this information to the bankers, you just release it into the wild. This should completely, remove any doubt whatsoever. Because if LinkedIn could make a statement that says, if we produce it, you can trust it, they would make that statement. It would be a massive differentiator. And they can't, and they're not going to. And we all know it. And so it's I agree. I think we're going to see this more and more. And the reality is the onus was always on you. This is going to be the equivalent of the dummy tags on every piece of product that we get. Do not suspend your baby from this thing. I mean, I have a toddler, and the warning labels are just flipping hilarious. It's like,
Don't stick
really?
your
Do I
head in a
need you to?
plastic bag.
Yeah, it's like,
Yes.
okay. So, that's what this is, and we're going to see more of it. But buyer beware, because it's all on you.
Mm-hmm. All right, caveat emptor. And on that note, that's been another week in enterprise tech. Thanks so much for joining us. Check your terms and conditions. And if you're checking us out, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know what we should be looking at for next week. Until then, thanks for joining us and see you next week.